Hello everyone, welcome to Deep Sight. Let us take you on a journey through historical time and space to explore the profound connotations of ancient civilizations. In our last video, we told the story of Justinian I of the Eastern Roman Empire who longed to restore the glory of Rome in the past and how Belisarius, the last general of Rome, destroyed the Vandals. So, after a protracted war, how would the devastated Eastern Roman army continue their path of conquest? How would Belisarius regain the distant Roman territory occupied by the Ostrogoths? Let us introduce to you in detail the most glorious moment in the history of the Eastern Roman Empire, restoring the glory of the Western Roman Empire in this issue. Between 533 and 550 AD, Justinian first launched a series of military operations, collectively known as the Reconquista in history. He dispatched his general Belisarius and other military commanders in a series of conquests and recaptures of the former territories of the Western Roman Empire. These included attacks against the Vandal Kingdom in North Africa, the Ostrogothic Kingdom in Italy, and other areas. Let us first take a look at the background of the conquest of the Ostrogothic Kingdom. In 493 AD, the leader of the Ostrogoths, Theodoric, killed Odoacer treacherously when he entertained him for a banquet. After that, he collected the rest and established the Ostrogoth Kingdom, with Ravenna as its capital. Its territory includes the Italian peninsula, Sicily, Dalmatia, and Bloings. The Ostrogothic Kingdom confiscated the land of Odoacer and his supporters, and the Roman landowners were required to pay 1/3 of the income from the territory to the Ostrogoths. Only in some areas, the Ostrogoths obtained 1/3 of the land. Theodoric implemented a policy of compromise towards the Romans, preserving the original Roman laws, political systems, and city management institutions, and allowing some Roman nobles to hold important positions. The Ostrogoths believed in Arian Christianity, but did not persecute the Roman Church. From a legal point of view, the Ostrogothic Kingdom established by Theodoric was just a subordinate state under the jurisdiction of the Emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. However, given the governance capabilities of the great empire at that time, there was a lack of effective methods to govern such a huge territory. The distance between Constantinople and Rome made all administrative methods beyond the reach, which led to the Eastern Roman Empire's influence on Theodoric. No real ability to discipline. Although the Western Roman Empire perished, the number of survivors of the Western Roman Empire in the Iberian Peninsula, Gaul, Italy, and other places was actually much larger than that of their rulers, the Germans. This is similar to the Mongol and Manchu ethnic minority rule in Chinese history. The situation in the mainstream is very similar. In these places, the application of the law is often based on ethnic background. The remnants of the Western Roman Empire still applied Roman law, while the Germans applied Germanic law. Italy, under the rule of Theodoric's Ostrogothic Kingdom, faced the same situation. The remnants of the Western Roman Empire also far outnumbered the Ostrogoths. The remnants of the Western Roman Empire followed Roman law, while the Ostrogoths were basically independent from the outside world, retaining their traditional customs and governing themselves internally. Most of the social institutions of the Western Roman Empire survived in Italy. As an outstanding statesman, under Theodoric's rule, he governed Italy better than any other late Roman emperor. The civilization of the Western Roman Empire continued in Italy under Theodoric. In the cities, the schools of law and rhetoric from the classical era flourished. He also changed the tax system to try to make it more equitable. Compared to the wars and chaos of the 5th century, Theodoric's rule gave Italy 30 years of peace. Theodoric was a wise diplomat who established a strong alliance network through royal marriages. His sister married the king of the Vandal Kingdom, one daughter married the king of Visigoth, and another daughter married the king of Burgundy in the Rhone Valley of France today. Theodoric himself even married the sister of Clovis I, king of the Frankish kingdom. The Ostrogothic Kingdom became the center of the four-way relationship between the kingdoms established by the Germanic barbarians. The biggest hidden danger in the control mechanism of the Ostrogothic Kingdom comes from the positioning of the kingdom. Theodoric was the king of the Ostrogoths and the king of a vassal state that submitted to the Eastern Roman Empire. The remnants of the Western Roman Empire believed in Orthodoxy, sect of Christianity, while the Ostrogoths believed in the controversial Arian sect of Christianity. The Ostrogothic comprehensive governance of Italy involved all aspects of social management, which was inseparable from the recognition and cooperation of the traditional residents of the Western Roman Empire. Before the two ethnic groups are fully integrated, the foundation of mutual trust is not solid. The rule of the entire kingdom relied primarily on Theodoric's personal ability as a monarch. Theodoric died in 526. The successor was Theodoric's minor grandson Adalaric, and Adalaric's mother, Theodoric's daughter Amarasuntha, became regent. After Amalasuntha became the regent of the Ostrogothic Kingdom, her fate was very sad. Her inheritance lacked strong support. She was surrounded by powerful nobles who had followed her father for many years. She continued to implement her father Theodoric's pro-Roman policies, but she did not have the same authority and stability as her father, lacking the base of rights. This policy caused dissatisfaction among some Ostrogoth nobles. After the death of her son Adalaric, she chose her cousin Theodahad as king, hoping to remain in power. However, Theodahad failed to live up to her expectations after ascending to the throne. He launched a coup, deposed her as regent, and exiled her to an island in Lake Bolsena. Soon after Theodahad's rule was stabilized, Amalasuntha was strangled to death in a bathhouse by his men. Let's look at the Eastern Roman Empire at this time. In 527 AD, Justinian I ascended to the throne of the Eastern Roman Empire. His ambition was to become the true monarch of a vast empire. In 533 AD, Justinian, who saw this great opportunity after the civil strife in the Vandals, ordered Belisarius to march westward to the Mediterranean and destroy their first enemy in their grand goal, the North African country Vandals established by the Germanic barbarians. Unplugged the worries of eradicating the Ostrogoths in the future. After Belisarius successfully conquered the Vandal kingdom in North Africa in 534 AD, he did not go directly to Rome. Instead, he first returned to Constantinople and participated in a grand triumphal ceremony, the first since Constantinople became the capital of the empire. Belisarius' army was also fully repaired during this time and strategically prepared for the next expedition. An outstanding tactician and commander, he built up a personal cavalry composed of Byzantines and some brave prisoners of war. This army achieved many important victories under his command. Belisarius was also very politically astute, and his wife Antonina had a close relationship with Queen Theodora, which made Belisarius' position in the court even more secure. Justinian gave Belisarius great trust and support, allowing the young general to command all Roman armies. As mentioned before, the political changes in the Ostrogoths gave Justinian new opportunities. The death of Amalasuntha eventually became the reason for the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian first to turn against the Ostrogoths and launch a war. The excuse is that for a vassal country to kill a pro-Eastern Roman Empire ruler without permission is a naked expression of hostility to the imperial rule. In 535 AD, Justinian ordered Belisarius to send out troops to conquer and restore Rome. The Germanic barbarian army, which had lived in relative peace for 30 years after being governed by Theodoric, had long lost its former fierce combat effectiveness at this time, in addition to political infighting. Belisarius led the Tiger and Wolf divisions of the Eastern Roman Empire as if they were in an uninhabited territory and quickly captured Sicily and used it as a base to land on the Italian peninsula. In 536 AD, Belisarius conquered Sicily in one go, then Naples and Rome. The Siege of Naples in 536 was a successful siege of Naples by the Eastern Roman Empire under Belisarius during the Gothic War. The Byzantine army under Belisarius, having subdued Sicily with ease, landed on mainland Italy in late spring 536 and advanced along the coast of Naples. The citizens of Naples, after being roused by two pro-Gothic orators named Pastor and Asclepiodotus, decided to resist, even though Belisarius presented the city with very favorable conditions for surrender. The citizens of Naples were also under the impression that Theodahad, king of the Ostrogoths, would send an army to relieve them. However, the siege dragged on for 20 days with numerous Byzantine casualties, and Belisarius was preparing to abandon it, until an Isaurian soldier under his command discovered an entrance into the city through its disused aqueduct. Belisarius sent engineers to widen the hole in the aqueduct while sending some soldiers to clear out the noise of the engineers working by banging their shields together. After giving the city a final chance to surrender, Belisarius launched his troops in a brutal sack. Belisarius had warned the Neapolitans at the beginning of the siege that if they put up any resistance he would be unable to restrain his army, which, he reminded them, was largely composed of semi-savage barbarians, from the murder, rapine, and pillage which they would consider their just reward after the capture of the city. But the warning had been ignored, and the miserable citizens now paid the price of their heroism. It was many hours before Belisarius was able to persuade his motley hordes of Alans and Isaurians, Herulians and Huns. These last, the most terrifying of all time, being pagans, they had no compunction in burning down the churches in which their intended victims had sought asylum, to put up their swords and spears and return to their various camps. The Ostrogothic garrison of 800 men was taken prisoner and treated well. The citizens of Naples, meanwhile, angrily killed Asclepiodotus for convincing them to reject Belisarius's demands, while Pastor committed suicide as the city fell. Under Belisarius' attack, the throne of the Ostrogothic Kingdom was transferred from Theoderic's family to another leader, Vitiges. In 536 AD, Vitiges ascended the throne as king of the Ostrogothic Kingdom during the war against Belisarius. The Ostrogothic Kingdom under the rule of Vitiges was unable to withstand the attacks of the Eastern Roman Empire. Belisarius continued north to capture Milan, and 4 years later in 540 AD, he captured Ravenna, the capital of the Ostrogothic Kingdom. Vitiges had no way to escape and became a prisoner. Emperor Justinian was not in a hurry to advance at this time, but gave the Ostrogoths a tolerant proposal. He asked the Ostrogoths to hand over half of the kingdom's property so that they could maintain an independent small town in northwest Italy. Belisarius informed the Ostrogoths of the emperor's opinion, but the Ostrogoths did not trust Justinian. They trusted Belisarius more, so they put forward a condition. As long as Belisarius endorsed it, they would accept the agreement. However, this condition brought the agreement to a deadlock and put the relationship between Belisarius and the emperor in an awkward position. Vitiges was captured and taken to Constantinople, where he died 2 years later in 542 AD. The cause of death is unknown. After his death, Vitiges' wife, Matasuenta, married the nobleman Germanus Justinus, a cousin of Justinian I. These details reflect the political and social mores of the time, as well as the Byzantine treatment of captives of nobles and royal families. In AD 540, following the defeat and capture of Vitiges, a group of nobles decided they needed a new leader. Eraric, the leader of this group of nobles, supported Belisarius, who had an outstanding reputation. After obtaining the consent of others, they decided to give up the throne of the Ostrogothic Kingdom to Belisarius. Belisarius changed his tone, pretended to agree to the proposal, and led the army to Ravenna for the coronation. Then he unexpectedly arrested the leader of the Ostrogoths and declared that the entire Ostrogothic Kingdom would be under the control of the Eastern Roman Empire. In the same year, Ildibad was elected as the new king of the Ostrogothic Kingdom, which bowed to the Eastern Roman Empire. Justinian's treatment of Eastern Rome was because the eastern side of the empire was fighting the powerful Persian Empire at this time. Therefore, Justinian first hoped that there would be a buffer zone on the west side of the Eastern Roman Empire to contain the rising empire. The Frankish kingdom was separated from the Eastern Roman Empire. On the other hand, the Ostrogoths' proposal to Belisarius made Justinian I suspicious. Justinian I was very dissatisfied with Belisarius' move to crown the king without asking for permission, and decided to transfer him east to fight against the powerful Persian Sasanian dynasty, and place the Italian peninsula under another official of the Eastern Roman Empire. Under the command of the trusted General John, Ildibad reigned for less than a year, and was succeeded by Eraric, who was also killed shortly afterwards. The next chosen to succeed the king was Totila. Totila was different from Eraric, who surrendered to the Eastern Roman Empire. His political stance was inclined towards the Ostrogoths, and he was an excellent leader. He led the Ostrogoths to rebel against the Eastern Roman Empire. The out-of-control Italy made Justinian extremely uneasy, and he hurriedly dispatched Belisarius to return to Italy. When Belisarius returned to the Apennine Peninsula in 545 AD, he found that the situation had changed drastically. Eraric has been killed. The Ostrogothic nobles who were pro-Eastern Roman Empire have also been overthrown, and the entire northern Italy is occupied by the Ostrogoths, who resist the power of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Ostrogoths even completely destroyed the troops of the Eastern Roman Empire and drove them out of Rome. Belisarius decisively led the army again and quickly recaptured Rome. However, Justinian, who had a rift with Belisarius, did not give Belisarius enough support and supplies, causing Belisarius to adopt a defensive posture. But this approach was of no avail in resisting the ferocious Ostrogoths, causing the empire to lose Rome again. In 548 AD, Justinian sent General Narses, whom he trusted more, to replace Belisarius. Narses did not disappoint Justinian. He began a brutal conquest of the Ostrogoths with an iron fist. In the next few years, he made significant progress step by step. In 552 AD, King Totila was killed in battle against the Eastern Romans. King Teia, who succeeded to the throne in the same year, also died in battle a year later. Teia also became the last king of the Ostrogothic Kingdom recorded in history. By 555 AD, all of Italy was conquered by the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Ostrogothic Kingdom was destroyed. The Ostrogoths disappeared from the stage of history. The Eastern Roman Empire finally realized its ideal of restoring the territory of the ancient Roman Empire. At that time, this era was no longer comparable to the past environment. The Germanic people everywhere would not succumb to the rule of the Eastern Roman Empire. Due to its remote location, the Eastern Roman Empire was unable to maintain control over the Italian peninsula for long due to the heavy burden of ruling the Italian peninsula, the huge expenditure of the military, constant external threats, and political problems within the empire. Eventually, these areas were lost again, and the territory of the Eastern Roman Empire gradually shrank. Although Justinian's Reconquista was an important but complex period in the history of the Eastern Roman Empire, it demonstrated the empire's military power and political ambitions, but also exposed its inherent fragility. Let us take another look at the ending of the famous General Belisarius. After his military career ended, Belisarius was recalled in 559 AD and commanded the Byzantine army against the Bulgar invasion in his final campaign. In 562 AD, a Roman general who refused to accept the position of king was accused of corruption. After a trial, Belisarius was found guilty and imprisoned. Soon after, Justinian granted him a special pardon, released him, and received him again at court. This series of operations shows Justinian's spicy political skills. In 565 AD, he passed away right after Justinian's death in the same year. He was quietly buried in a corner of the local St. Peter or St. Paul Church. His fame and contribution to the Byzantine Empire made him immortal in history. His military prowess and successful campaigns, especially against the Persians and Goths, are remembered by later generations. Dear friends, in a short period of time, we have followed the wheel of history and traveled side by side through those moments where history has lingered. It allows us to truly experience calmness and makes us more upright and strong. Compared with any tide in history, what we are experiencing today is just like a tiny speck of dust falling into the Milky Way. Has our world today become more civilized due to changes in time? How far is peace from us? This is the sincere hope of every kind-hearted person. This is the content of our historical exploration in this issue. Regarding the subsequent fate of the Italian peninsula, we will introduce you to another rising Germanic barbarian country, the Kingdom of Lombardy, in the next issue. Thank you for watching and accompanying me. I am your navigator on the time journey, Stardust. If you use people as a guide, you can know the gains and losses. If you use history as a guide, you can know the ups and downs. Let us gain insight into the distant past and foresee a bright future. See you next time.